So today's guest on Keen on Yoga is Dr. Mikel Burley. Michael is an associate professor of religion and philosophy at Leeds University and a very, very well published. I remember reading his book, what's it called? Hatha-Yoga, Context and Practice. And it really influenced my early journey with yoga, I have to say. And subsequent to that, Mikel's been published with Bloomsbury for a couple of books and Routledge and some great tomes in there. And I really recommend you to dive into some of the other kind of hefty work that he's done, such as Contemporary Religious Forms of Life, Wittgenstein. If you can stomach Wittgenstein, then you've really done well in life. And Rebirth in the Stream of Life, which I have to say I have read this one, and it's also fantastic. So without further ado, welcome Mikel to the Keen on Yoga podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Adam. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So I suppose straight away I'll just dive into the main subject. And I know you've spoken about this many times already, but for our audience that might not be familiar and we're hearing these words banded, I suppose what I could say is that yoga has expanded now and people are becoming more aware of the philosophy behind it and more aware of certain terms. Like I think when I started, unless it was just me, people had never heard of Samkhya philosophy, right? Now we're hearing, just in the general terms, a lot more about the Samkhya philosophy particularly. Just want to kind of maybe say a few words. I know you've written whole books about this, but on the basics so people can get a grasp, first of all, our listenership on the basic rudiments of what this means for yoga.
Mm. Well, yes. I mean, for a yoga audience or a primarily yoga audience, probably the best way of introducing Samkhya is to say that the classical yoga of Patanjali is itself a form of Samkhya. At least that's the way that it's traditionally presented. It's presented within the primary commentary itself as an exposition of Samkhya, and so. A common way of characterizing the relation between yoga and Samkhya has been that Samkhya is more concerned with the conceptual framework. We might even say the sort of theoretical and conceptual dimensions of the system, whereas yoga practice, especially meditation practice, is more associated with, as I've just indicated, the practical side. And I think it's a perfectly reasonable way, at least as a starting point, for characterizing the relationship between Samkhya and yoga, is to say that they are two parts of a comprehensive system, and that system combines elements of philosophical theory and conceptualization on the one side that's primarily associated with Samkhya, and meditation practice on the other, which is more associated with the term yoga. And then we find, a number of different traditional texts in which these dimensions, these aspects, the practical and the theoretical, are presented. And those texts are more or less compatible with one another, but that's one way of at least getting the ball rolling, as it were, in sort of characterizing them.
Would it be right to suggest that Samkhya is a kind of philosophical underpinning of the whole of the philosophical viewpoint of Indian classical philosophy? Would you say
that might be making a slightly grand claim for Samkhya, but it is certainly extremely important and pervasive in its influence. So I wouldn't characterize it as sort of underpinning the whole of classical Indian philosophy, but the primary ideas, the key sort of concepts of Samkhya go back a long way. We can trace them to at least the early Upanishads, probably 7th or 8th century BCE, and at the time when the those early Upanishads were being composed, there wasn't really a strong systematic Indian philosophical tradition. It was more like that. It was burgeoning. It was starting to grow. It was developing at that time. So we do find traces of Samkhya thought right back at the beginnings, I would say, of the formation of the Indian philosophical tradition. So to that extent, it has a strong part to play in the formation and origination of Indian philosophy, but there were other elements there too. So there were also the sort of early sources of what came to be different systematizations of Vedanta. We might think in terms of Advaita Vedanta, for example. You can trace notions of Advaita Vedanta, non-dualist Vedanta philosophy, to the early Upanishads as well. And so for that reason, for that and some other reasons, it would be misleading to say that Samkhya is the philosophy of, whether it be the Upanishads or certainly Indian philosophy more generally. You've got these different sources kind of flowing into a longer tradition.
So what are the key concepts, if you could put your finger on it, of Samkhya, and how does maybe comparing those for people to get an idea as to, I asked that question, I suppose, specifically, but misleadingly in a way, to say Vedanta, right? And how Samkhya correlates within the general framework.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Samkhya philosophy is best known for being a dualist system of philosophy, and I think that's a perfectly legitimate way of characterizing it. So two primary principles that are irreducible, not reducible to anything more foundational, fundamental, and those primary principles, co-fundamental principles, are in the Sanskrit Purusha on the one side and Prakriti on the other. They're the primary terms that are used. And exactly how to interpret those concepts is of course, it's a big interpretive task when it comes to trying to fathom out what's going on in the Samkhya philosophy. But I would be inclined to describe Purusha as the source of consciousness. One could even just say consciousness or pure consciousness or something like that. But just to hedge my bets a little bit, I think I would say the source of consciousness, and Prakriti as the source of everything that is experienceable, by consciousness, and also the sort of conditions that have to be in place in order for anything to become experienceable at all. So as a somewhat loose description, we could call Prakriti the source of objectivity, and Purusha is the source of subjectivity. And when those two principles come together, in some sense of coming together, the possibility of experience is there, because you've got the source of subjectivity, so the source of being able to experience something on the one side, and the possibility of being experienced on the other, and so experience can emerge out of that conjunction.
That's a great definition, but that's pretty deep. What is the reason in the first place that these are given in the metaphysical sense that in Samkhya for this duality that it comes out of? Because people think of Samkhya as some people say that Samkhya is atheistic, but it's definitely God as a source principle of Purusha, right? I'm going to ask you a little bit more about that in a second, but God is definitely in there. Does he play a role in the metaphysics of it? How does two things come out of one thing?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, yes. So the role of God or the Lord, or the term Ishwara in Samkhya and Yoga is not a straightforward one. Right. So let's just dwell on that for a moment. So I haven't specifically mentioned the titles of key Samkhya texts, but let me just get two on the table, as it were. So one, known as the Samkhya Karika, dating from, we don't know exactly, but roughly 4th, 5th, possibly 6th century CE, in the Common Era. But it claims, the Samkhya Karika claims, or the author of it claims, to be expounding a system of thought that was earlier than the text itself. So the author is not claiming to be original, but rather summarizing, condensing earlier ideas from a source that we no longer have. So we can't compare Sankhya with the earlier source that it's claiming to be derived from. And the Sankhya comprises 72, in some editions 73 verses, quite dense. They require a commentary, to be properly understood or to be filled out a bit.
It's pretty dense, yes.
As is often the case. Yeah. But that's one text, and it's attributed to that the name of the author is Ishwara Krishna. We should just sort of bracket that for a moment. Not the fact that he's got the word Ishwara in his name is kind of neither here nor there when it comes to the presence of Ishwara within the system itself. But the author's name is Ishwara Krishna. And we think that roughly around the same time was when the Yoga Shastra was also being composed. Now, the term Yoga Shastra, as you may know, is these days used for what we used to and still do quite commonly refer to as the Yoga Sutra plus the earliest commentary, the commentary that has sort of probably apocryphally been attributed to Vyasa. So it's sometimes known as the Vyasa Bhashya, but sometimes also just as known as the Yoga Bhashya. The sort of foundational, the first commentary on the sutra collection. So that combination of texts, the sutras themselves, 195 or sometimes 196 sutras, plus the commentary on them, known as the Yoga Shastra, and traditionally attributed to Patanjali. At least the sutras have traditionally been attributed to Patanjali. The commentary traditionally attributed to Vyasa, but relatively recent scholarship primarily by Philippe Maas, whose work you're probably familiar with.
Yeah, we've had him on this. Yeah.
I mean, he's made a very, very strong case for thinking of these as a combined text.
I think also if we talk, sorry to interrupt, Edwin Bryant was also saying that I think the presence in the Anu-Yoga Anusasanam, Hatha-Yoga Anusasanam was a continuous. Now it continues this right. So it's Patanjali is continuing something, as you said, with the Karika that is already there. He's just kind of continuing the teaching of this kind of thread of thinking.
Yes, indeed. Yes, you're referring there to the very opening sutra, Hatha-Yoga Anusasanam, which we can translate as roughly and now an exposition of yoga, but implying that it's not something that's novel to this text. It's something what I'm presenting. Hatha-Yoga Anusasanam is an exposition of a body of teachings that sort of pre-exists. Yeah, I think you're quite right. Where was I? So I was just saying that these are two absolutely crucial foundational texts for the Sankhya Yoga tradition. We've got the Sankhya Karika and the Yoga Shastra, both probably composed around the 4th or 5th centuries CE. And within those texts, we find a lot of the key concepts that we're going to be dealing with in this conversation. And just to go back to where this came from, you were asking me about the place of God.
And how duality came into being from a oneness. Yeah.
Within the philosophy, and so I think we do well. We help ourselves if we refer to these two texts specifically, and ask the questions that raise the question. Well, what if anything is the place of God, the concept of God in those textual sources? And it's somewhat different, at least on the face of it. So I'll start with the Yoga Sutra or the Yoga Shastra. Ishwara, the concept of Ishwara, has a prominent place in the first Pada, in the so-called Samadhi Pada. So, as you and many of the viewers will probably know, within the Yoga Sutras as a whole, and perhaps especially within the Samadhi Pada, we have more or less a list of sort of meditative objects or meditative options, we might say, things that one might focus one's attention on in order to cultivate a state of samadhi. And we get this throughout the text, and we get a lot. There's the third pada, the Vibhuti pada, has a whole list of different objects, possible objects of meditation, and the different powers that one can acquire. So it's not exclusively in the Samadhi pada, but in the Samadhi pada, one of the meditative objects that's given is Ishwara. One can meditate on Ishwara. Ishwara pranidhana is the term that's used, which is open to various translations. But meditation on Ishwara or contemplation of Ishwara, those are, I think, perfectly legitimate translations of the term Ishwara pranidhana. And so of course it raises the question: well, what is Ishwara? How are we to think about Ishwara in a context of the yoga philosophy? And the way that Ishwara is presented is as a special Purusha. Now, Purusha, as I said before, we can think of as the source of consciousness, but a very common translation of Purusha would be self. A little bit like the more Vedantic term Atman, self, sometimes written with a capital S to indicate that there's something special. There's a kind of spiritual source of our being that concept represents. And so Purusha, if we think of Purusha as a self or the self, Ishwara is a special one of those, as defined in the Yoga Sutra. Special in what sense? Special in the sense that Purusha has never been tainted by any kind of involvement in karmic activity. That would be one way of thinking about it. So for most of us, all of us, we are this spiritual source, this spiritual essence that is our true being. But there's a sense in which we've gone through our lives, our multiple lifetimes, through processes of reincarnation and so on, not being fully attuned with that true self. So there's some sense in which we've been tainted by the world. We've been immersed in forms of suffering, forms of experience that are perhaps gratifying in certain ways and troubling in other ways. But we've been sort of engaged in worldly activity in that way. Whereas Ishwara has never gone through that. And so Ishwara is defined as a kind of pure self, a pure source of consciousness, and hence a kind of ideal, a sort of spiritual ideal to meditate upon and to become absorbed in that spiritual quality, and thereby we might hope, according to the yoga thought and practice, we might hope to cultivate a deeper sense of spiritual purity in our own being through that meditation process. But what and so there are a few other things said about Ishwara in the Yoga Sutra, including that Ishwara is the first guru, the first teacher, which is
whereabouts is that? Do you know which sutra that is?
Well, it comes very. I think Ishwara Pranidhana is introduced at Sutra 24 of the Samadhi Pada, right. and I might be one or two sutras out, but if I remember right, I think it's about Sutra 26, where right. Ishwara is defined as the earliest, the Purva guru, the earliest or primary guru teacher, spiritual preceptor. Now, you can interpret that more or less metaphorically. You could think of Ishwara as some sort of maybe an avatar, somebody that incarnated in human form in order to be a teacher, a sort of sage-like guru teacher to the earliest practitioners of yoga. Or if one wanted to go more sort of metaphorical or symbolic, one could think of again Ishwara as that inspirational ideal that one is aiming to resemble in some way through cultivating one's own spirituality, and hence a teacher in that sense, a teacher in the sense of the ideal to be aimed for and that which one sort of learns from in that way.
But there's not there's no kind of devotional aspect to it, isn't it? That's what always stands out in Samkhya for me. It's quite kind of cold and analytical. We don't find the devotive aspect that we find obviously in Vedanta, etc. And it's Jnana Yoga, isn't it? So strangely, the Purusha of Ishvara is defined as the ultimate Purusha, but we still don't worship it. It's kind of used for our own good. As I understand it, kind of like, well, I'll get what I can out of Purusha rather than seeing, which kind of seems strange to me in a way, philosophically, that you've recognized the ultimate Purusha and you don't worship it. You just kind of think, well, I'll meditate on it to get as far as I can. Like, yeah.
Yes, I think you're right. I don't think devotion is strongly emphasized at all, but I would just qualify it slightly by saying that among the ways of understanding this notion of pranidhana, I emphasize the meditation, the contemplation sort of side of it. Devotion is kind of part of that concept as well. But the way that it's described within the Yoga Sutra and the primary commentary, it doesn't emphasize very much the sort of bhakti side, the really devotional side of practice.
Do you think it's there though? Yeah. Do you feel it's there? Because I mean, obviously, Samkhya philosophy pervades the Gita as well, and in the Gita we find a different presentation where when Krishna reveals himself to Arjuna, in all these forms, Arjuna falls kind of flat on the ground and buries his face, right? And kind of, begs forgiveness, right? So there is that, and we feel devote to me is the constant refrain through the Gita, which is also Samkhya, as I understand it, right? So maybe it is there. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. No. It's quite right to point this out that. As I hinted earlier, Sankhya concepts are pervasive through Indian philosophical tradition, along with what we might call various forms of Vedanta thought. And the Gita is one of those places where we find key Sankhya concepts running right through the text. And yet not fully consistently. So the Gita is an amalgamation, I think, of different sort of philosophical perspectives, and does a very remarkable job of in some ways synthesizing, in other ways just bringing together into sort of proximity to one another different philosophical ideas and concepts. And of course, a devotion to Krishna, devotion to a divine, to a divinity is absolutely central to the Bhagavad Gita, and so the Gita gives us one model of how Sankhya ideas can be brought within a sort of theistic framework, as we might say. I just want to return briefly to both the Yoga Sutra and also say something about the Sankhya Karika in relation to this theme of devotion. Now, the practice that's recommended in the Yoga Sutra, that is the practice of Ishwara Pranidhana, is meditation upon the mantra Om. It's sort of repetition of the mantra Om to the point where the mantra Om is kind of filling this vibration is filling one's consciousness. So that's it's noteworthy. It's an interesting point that that is the way that and it's the so it's not a devotional form of practice, as you sort of indicate, and yet it's a form of absorption in the divine, in this case the sort of divine sound. So I think drawing sharp distinctions between what's devotion and what's more something more meditative and contemplative is not it's not a straightforward task here. I think there's you could think of it as a kind of devotion, because what is devotion if it's not sort of becoming immersed and absorbed in the object of devotion? So there's a meditative, contemplative dimension to devotion itself.
And would that be the aim of Samkhya? Just to kind of flesh out this kind of picture of Samkhya for people, would that be the aim, a kind of absorption into spirit, so differentiation of the Purusha back from matter, from its kind of ensnarement in matter, and essentially transcendental aspirations, really, to escape the world of matter and kind of reside someplace else with the ultimate kind of daddy Purusha, as it were.
Yes. Well, let's think. So, in the case of the Samkhya Karika, so there are various kinds of what we could call we could call them sort of theistic versions of Samkhya, and the Bhagavad Gita, what's presented there is one instance. But what we find in the Samkhya Karika is something a little bit more pared down, not quite so sort of religiously, theistically elaborate. It's a little bit more austere, we could think of, I suppose, in its conceptualization, which I think you were sort of suggesting earlier, and I think you're quite right in this. And so, a couple of things I want to say. One is, despite that, there are the seeds, the possible seeds, the germs, as it were, of a devotional attitude, even within the Samkhya Karika. And we find this towards the end of the text, where the author, Ishwara Krishna, is referring to the sage, the Paramarshi, the prime rishi or seer or sage, to whom he is attributing the foundation, the sort of founding of the Samkhya philosophy. He's attributing that to this figure called the Paramarshi. Now, Paramarshi is a title, and most commentators think that title refers to Kapila, who is a renowned sage within the ancient Vedic tradition and subsequent to that. And just as an aside, actually, the Kapila is regarded as an avatar of Vishnu, according to the tradition. Now, there's no reference to that in the Samkhya Karika, but there's the association with Kapila as the founder of the Samkhya philosophy, and again, according to tradition, an avatar, an incarnation of Vishnu. So a sort of divine sage-like figure. And he is, as I say, regarded as the founder of Samkhya philosophy, and is stated to be such obliquely, because he's referred to as Paramarshi rather than explicitly as Kapila, but as Paramarshi within the Samkhya Karika itself. Now, Ishwara Krishna doesn't then say, and hence we should bow down in obeisance and devotion to that sage, but I think nevertheless the seed is there. It's part of this standard lineage type structure, where you've got this founding figure who is implicitly regarded as a great, holy, divine, sage-like figure. So I think there's even as I say, the seeds of a devotional attitude within the Samkhya Karika itself. So I wanted to say that, and I think there was something else, but it slipped my mind for the time being. So let's move on.
Yeah, well, we've got other questions where they came from. I mean, what about you speak a lot? I mean, you sent me an excellent article actually on free will and determinism as it relates to this Purusha Prakriti idea, because if pretty much all of us is enmeshed in Prakriti, and Purusha is always separate from Prakriti. Well, first of all, why need to do anything? Because Purusha is already pure, always pure, and never actually tainted by Prakriti? And secondly, if we were to do anything, how can we possibly make a move? Because everything is ensnared in Prakriti. How is it possible ever to get to Purusha? There must be some gateway or bridge. Otherwise, we're trapped completely deterministically in this constant spiral.
Yeah. Yeah, these are indeed difficult interpretive questions, and in some ways they would, in order to arrive at a satisfactory answer, I think we would have to go beyond what we're given in the traditional sources. So my sort of interpretive preference is to think, what are these texts trying to do? What are they trying to present us with? And I think the answer to that is not ultimately a completely watertight, fully worked out metaphysical system of everything, which in a sense we would need if we were going to answer at least some of those questions to do with the ultimate relation between Purusha and Prakriti and how that bears upon free will and so on. Mm-hmm. So what we really get, I think, is maybe just implied answers, but answers that if we try to push them too far, I do suspect that we're going to end up with something that tends to break down, in terms of conceptual coherence. Mm-hmm. And thinking about it charitably, being charitable to the authors, the composers of the systems themselves, it's just that probably wasn't what they were in the business of doing. They weren't trying to make it all completely coherent theoretically, but rather were presenting us with materials that would facilitate an adequate level of understanding of the practical dimensions of the system. So I don't. That's not going to be very satisfactory if somebody is looking for a theoretical answer. But I can say more. I can say more about the relation between Purusha and Prakriti as presented in the systems.
Is there a bridge between the two, and what is that? Yes.
The closest we get to a bridge is the concept of buddhi. And buddhi is related to the word Buddha. Buddhi is the sort of faculty of, I have an unusual translation of it. I translate it as intentional consciousness, which is a technical term. But what I mean by intentional consciousness is consciousness of something. So if we think of Purusha as consciousness in itself, as it were, I think that's a difficult concept to get one's head around, but consciousness in itself, independently of any content or object of experience.
The mechanism of consciousness in potentiality.
Consciousness in potentiality sounds like a good like a good way of thinking of it, and that's a bit why I hedged earlier and said the source of consciousness, as a attempt at a definition of Purusha, precisely because it's entirely understandable, and I think it's probably the right thing to think of consciousness as standardly having some content to it. What is consciousness independently of any content? Yeah. As I say, I think that's a difficult concept, and it's one that maybe scholars of mysticism have to grapple with. I think it's there in the Samkhya philosophy. I think Samkhya philosophy claims that there is such a thing as pure consciousness independent of any consciousness, and that is Purusha. But figuring out how to conceptualize that is something else. So we can think of it as potential consciousness or the source of consciousness. That's Purusha. And then buddhi, as I was just saying, is consciousness of, consciousness directed towards, consciousness with some content to it. And yet buddhi is placed on the prakriti side of the dualism. So it's not easy to know exactly how we're to think about buddhi, but buddhi is that it's, as I say, the closest we get to a bridge. It's the way that the Samkhya philosophy would put it is it's the most subtle, it's the most refined, it's the most sensitive level or layer or aspect or component of the manifestation of Prakriti. Yeah. So it's that which enables Purusha to have experience of anything at all, and buddhi is that consciousness of. That's the way I think of it.
Kind of, don't they also say it's a kind of reflection, like a kind of mirror, really? So it's not it's not actually inherent in the material being that's always Prakriti, but somehow reflected upon that. So they kind of get out of the way of some Purusha being contained in Prakriti, which is impossible, right? So somehow the Purusha is reflected upon this inert kind of substance or something like that. But I mean, there's no ultimate way to get out of the dualism, really, is there? You're always stuck between finding this bridge between these two concepts, which kind of aren't the same, aren't the same thing.
Yeah, but no, I think bringing in the mirror analogy is a good way to go. It's just as another aside. It's a common strategy. It's a common approach within India. I think it's fair to say Indian philosophy generally, but certainly including the Samkhya and Yoga presentation of ideas, is to make abundant use of images or analogies. Including that of a reflective surface. So, although we don't find it within the sutras, or indeed within the Sankhya themselves, we do find it in certain commentarial sources. The image of, normally it's a sort of body of water where you've got the sort of surface of the water, which is the reflective surface, and under ordinary circumstances that reflective surface is distorted because it's choppy. You got the various ripples, and we might think of those ripples as what are referred to as the vrittis in the yoga philosophy. So literally the turnings of chitta. So chitta vritti is a term that's used early on in the Yoga Sutra to refer to the sort of turnings of the mind, the various modifications of awareness or consciousness, and ordinarily those are they're turning, they're rippling, they're churning about, and through the meditative practice. In principle, one is able to quell the surface of that metaphorical body of water, precisely in order that the true self, whether we call it Purusha or in yoga Drashta, the seer, is in some way reflected in the water. By analogy, sometimes the analogy of the moon being reflected on the surface of water, the moon being this beautiful, pristine orb that is the reflection is often distorted on the water, but if the water becomes still, then the reflection can become pure. And that's an image. That's the image that we're given for this kind of, if not a bridge, then at least some connecting interface that enables Purusha to become absorbed in its own true self.
And is that how Purusha would escape the kind of karmic regression, whereby it's always kind of ensconced in karma and can never kind of see itself? Or I suppose what I'm asking is, what's the position of karma as a kind of central kind of tenet of Samkhya, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We don't find any detailed exposition of the concept of karma in the Sankhya, for example, but it's sort of implicit. It's at least implicit in the background. It's in fact this whole sort of samsara, reincarnation, karma complex of ideas is implicit behind much Indian philosophy, and it's almost so taken for granted that it's relatively rare to find a detailed exposition of how it all works, and so we don't find that either in Sankhya or in yoga. We do have the concept of in yoga we have the concept of sanskara. These things that are often translated as something like impressions or mental impressions, that we receive through our experiences, and that are in some way embedded in our memory or in our mind, and that form the seeds of future activity. It could be mental activity, it could be sort of physical actions, and that it's thought that has something, you know, very deep to do with the mechanism of karma, that we undergo certain experiences, they get embedded within our ways of thinking. Maybe they form habits and, you know, patterns of behavior that we then enact, we repeat, and they get further entrenched, and they get so deeply entrenched that they persist across lifetimes, you know, from one reincarnation to another.
And that's, I mean,
so all of that. Yeah.
Sorry, I wanted to say, I mean, it also seems to me that without reincarnation, the whole thing falls apart, right? So you're kind of in the you know, in the beginnings, but, you know, for example, in the Gita, the thing that Krishna says to Arjuna is like, basically, you got to believe in reincarnation, and here's the argument for it, right? Like, I mean, maybe you'll say differently, but it seems like if you don't take reincarnation as fundamental, then basically the law of karma kind of falls apart, really, because you can't see it over one life. Then necessarily people get their just desserts, as it were. So we're back to Plato, you know, asking, you know, saying, you know, well, what about the just man? You know, like, what is there any inherency about being just, right? Because someone might do bad actions and still benefit in this life, seemingly so, right? So do we have to accept reincarnation for this to make sense, or is there a way that Samkhya can get around that as well?
I think the short answer is yes. That it's, as I said before, it's implicit within the philosophical framework. The whole idea that this life that we're undergoing now is not the one and only for us, in some sense of us. And then it's rather complicated exactly what is that carries on from one life to another. But yes, I mean, the Sankhya Karika starts off in the very first verse by saying that the philosophical inquiry stems from the recognition that we're undergoing various forms of dukkha, or suffering, or dissatisfactoriness, which is also, as many people will know, the sort of starting point of Buddhism, and the starting point of other kind of soteriological systems that are designed to bring about some sort of liberation from. And then the question is, well, liberation from what? Well, liberation from suffering. But if the way of achieving liberation from suffering was simply to cease living, then it wouldn't be obvious what the problem was. One would have to go through this lifetime, and maybe this lifetime isn't fully satisfactory, and one undergoes various forms of suffering. But if at the end of this lifetime, that those deeply embedded forms of suffering come to an end, then that's the solution. But that isn't the solution, because it's implied that there is reincarnation, and hence, even when we complete this lifetime, we haven't completed the ongoing cycles. And so the presence, the pervasiveness of suffering in life goes beyond the present life, and that's what generates the problem that is to be resolved or escaped from through not just philosophical inquiry, of course, but through the various forms of practice that need to accompany that.
Yeah. As Shakespeare says, perchance to dream, to die, perchance to dream. There's the rub, right? It's like the possibility, the possibility of something, other than just getting through it, that something might happen, and then you're in trouble because you can't just kill yourself. Which, but what's the suffering in the first place? What I mean, I have to admit that the Karika is a dense tome that I have struggled with. How do they contextualize why we are suffering if we don't know already?
Right. Yeah. No. Interesting. I mean, it's funny that it's the kind of starting point, the recognition that we do undergo various forms of suffering, but it's more like the starting point rather than the well, I was going to say it's not that the question is then why do we suffer. It's more just how do we alleviate, how do we liberate ourselves from that suffering. I think that's probably the way to phrase the question. So the question, the emphasis is on how do we overcome, how do we get beyond, how do we transcend that suffering predicament. And the question, why are we suffering in the first place, is just a slightly different one, but they are closely related, of course. Because ultimately the answer to the question, why do we suffer, is going to be something along the lines of, because we falsely identify ourselves. We identify with something that we are not. And the thing that we identify with undergoes suffering. And so what we need to do in order to transcend the suffering is to stop falsely identifying with that which suffers. But still, you might think, well, that's not quite an answer to the question, why does that suffering arise in the first place? And I think maybe there's a sense in which that question is not addressed. It's not thought to be the question that's important. The question that's important is recognize that we suffer, and let's work on progressing towards a state of less suffering, and then finally liberation from suffering altogether.
I recognise it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour between a number of points and discursive ideas, but I wanted to get as much out of you as I could. I mean, finally, just to finish it off, I know you've done a lot of comparative work, and that's a particular interest of yours in comparing and contrasting Western philosophy to Eastern, right? And also promoting Eastern philosophy as a serious rigor philosophically as a discipline, which until recently it was kind of dismissed as religion or mysticism or something, and now that's just, we're starting to see comparative to particularly you mentioned Kant a number of times, I think, in previous things I've listened to. Can you draw any other parallels between Wittgenstein? Obviously, you've written a whole book on. Can you draw any other easy or simplistic parallels for our listenership? Maybe that they might, kind of relate this philosophy to Western ideas as well.
Yes, I can certainly try to do that. I think relating these philosophical systems to Wittgenstein would be difficult. I'm very strongly influenced by Wittgenstein's approach to the study of various forms of philosophy and also religious systems. But that's more because Wittgenstein in his later work was very eager to give close attention to the way that words, terms, concepts are used within the contexts where they are used, and rather than sort of detaching them from those contexts. So as a general methodological approach, I think the contextualization that Wittgenstein encourages us to do is helpful. But when it comes to drawing analogies between sort of classical Indian and European forms of philosophy, I've looked towards, yes, Immanuel Kant, as you say, and also what gets called the phenomenological philosophical tradition within European philosophy. So I'll just say something. I mean, it's difficult to say it briefly, but I'll try to say something fairly briefly about phenomenology and how I think that can provide a useful analogy for what's going on in Samkhya thought and practice. One way to put it is this, that phenomenology is concerned with the investigation of experience, and hence the investigation of how things appear to us in consciousness. And so that is the driving question of phenomenological philosophy, is how do things appear to us in consciousness? And so that can be one can begin with a sort of descriptive approach, how do things appear, how do we experience things. But then also there's a sort of what are the conditions for us to have the kind of experience that we have? What sort of faculties do we need to have in order to have those experiences? What do we need to be able to do in order to have the experiences that we do have? And my sense is that that question is also at the heart of Samkhya philosophy. What needs to be in place in order for us to have the kind of experience that we do, the kinds of experiences that we do? Because what we haven't talked much about is the fact that within the Sankhya we find a fairly elaborate system of different principles. I mentioned buddhi, but there's also multiple others. There's ahankara, which gets translated as the principle of individuation or egoism, or I translate it as egoity, the sense of being a self, being an I, being an individual. And then we've got lots of others. They've got 5 sense capacities. We've got 5 so-called action capacities. We've got the 5 forms of content of sensory experience, and we've got the 5 forms of material objects. And then there's another one that I missed out, which is manas, which is the principle of just translated as mind. But which seems to serve a kind of synthesizing function. It brings these different aspects of experience together to form a coherent whole for us. And so you might say, well, that's one answer to the question, how is it that we come to have the kind of experiences that we do? Well, what it requires, among other things, is not only the various components of experience, so whether it be the visual and the auditory and the gustatory and the olfactory and the tactile kind of sensations. We need those in order to have the kind of experience that we have. We also need something that's going to combine them together, that's going to synthesize them, that's going to bring them within one sort of perspective, one viewpoint, as a cohesive, coherent, experiential package. And that, on my interpretation, is the primary function of the faculty of manas, of mind. And then, the different other components of the system perform other functions. But it seems to me that a plausible that what this system is providing an answer to, a plausible question that it's addressing, is what are the necessary conditions for experience to occur as it does. And the analogy that I'm it's a fairly loose analogy, but the analogy that I'm drawing here is that in a sense is the same question that's being asked by the phenomenological philosophical tradition within European thought. And so the benefit of using the analogy is not just so that we can say, oh look, Sankhya is doing that, certain phenomenologists are doing that, isn't that interesting? They're doing something similar. It's rather that we can actually use the sort of answers that that are provided by one system in order to illuminate what's going on in the other. Use it as a kind of lens, as a through which to develop an interpretation.
In comparing, to kind of develop understanding on both sides, rather than simply validating Eastern thought by kind of pairing it to Western thought. Oh, we see it here as well, therefore it's valid, or absolutely. Right. Well, yes, we could go a lot more into that, but I think we'll leave it there for today. And all that remains to be said is thank you, Dr. Mick Burley, for coming on, and it's been a fantastic chat, albeit too short, and I hope people appreciate this. If you do, then obviously remember to subscribe to whatever we're doing, and you'll see more of this stuff. Thanks again, Mick.